You don't belong on that bench, you Constitution-loving bitch! Detective Keith Harrison's roar was a sonic boom of pure hatred, a shockwave of venom that ripped through the sanctified air of the federal courtroom. In the same breath, he hurled the judge's heavy wooden gavel, the very symbol of the law he was sworn to uphold, directly at Judge Iris Beaumont's face. But that single violent act of desecration instantly became the beginning of the end, the final fatal miscalculation in a career built on a bedrock of lies, corruption, and cold-blooded murder. This wasn't just a physical assault on a black judge. This was the precise moment a bully, accustomed to absolute power and shielded by a corrupt system, finally pushed too far in front of the one goddamn person he never should have crossed. Harrison, in his white-hot racist fury, had no idea that the woman he'd just tried to silence had been spending her nights quietly and meticulously reviewing habeas corpus evidence that certain powerful people desperately wanted to stay buried forever. This evidence included video footage from a case that had destroyed an innocent family and meticulously covered up the state-sanctioned execution of a black teenager. What had started as a routine constitutional hearing became the spark that would ignite a firestorm. A sprawling federal investigation that would expose a festering cancer of corruption at the highest equipartitions of American law enforcement. Watch this until the very end, because this time, when the system tried to protect its own killer cops, the whole goddamn foundation cracked. And what came next changed everything for those who thought murdering black children was just another acceptable part of the job. The Wednesday morning sun cast long, accusatory shadows through the towering arched windows of Courtroom 5B in the Denver Federal District Court. For decades, the polished mahogany benches in this room had witnessed monumental constitutional battles, legal skirmishes that had shaped the very foundations of civil rights in America. But this morning would be different. This would be the day that 15 years of systematic, state-sanctioned injustice would finally, spectacularly explode in the face of someone who had the power, the will, and the righteous fury to fight back. Judge Iris Beaumont adjusted her reading glasses, her gaze fixed on the habeas corpus petition that had been her obsessive companion for 4 straight sleepless nights. The document in her hands bore the desperate, tear-stained signature of Zaria Coleman, a mother whose 16-year-old son, Jude, had been rotting in the Denver County Jail for 8 agonizing months on charges that made no goddamn legal sense under any sane interpretation of Colorado law. The petition laid out the facts in stark, brutal detail. Jude Coleman, an honor roll student at East High School, had been arrested for conspiracy to commit aggravated assault on a police officer and possession of evidence indicating gang affiliation. But Judge Beaumont had learned to read between the lines of police reports long ago, especially those bearing the smug, self-satisfied signature of Detective Keith Harrison. At 46 years old, with 19 years of constitutional law experience under her belt, first as a tenacious public defender, then as a federal prosecutor, and now as a judge, she had developed an almost psychic instinct for recognizing the toxic patterns of abuse that others, either through fear or complicity, preferred to ignore. Jude sat at the defendant's table, swimming in the bright orange jumpsuit that had become his daily uniform. His hands were shackled, a gratuitous display of force for a teenager who posed no conceivable threat to anyone in the courtroom. At 16, he carried himself with the careful, heartbreaking dignity of a young man who had learned the hard way that survival in this predatory system often depended on making himself as small and non-threatening as possible, even while his constitutional rights were being systematically stripped from him. His mother, Zaria Coleman, sat bolt upright in the front row, clutching a worn manila folder as if it were a holy relic. Inside was the life Detective Harrison was trying to steal. Straight A report cards, glowing letters of recommendation from teachers, and official documentation of her son's acceptance to 3 different colleges. It was a folder full of evidence of a future that had been meticulously built and savagely stolen through fabricated charges and perjured testimony. Wait until you see what Harrison says when he realizes who he's really dealing with. The courtroom door burst open with the force of a man who had never been denied entry anywhere in his goddamn life. The heavy brass hinges protested with a loud groan under Detective Keith Harrison's aggressive entrance. At 6'3", with the solid, imposing build of a former Marine, Harrison filled the doorway like a conqueror, stepping onto territory he owned, not a public servant appearing before the constitutional authority he was sworn to serve. His dark blue uniform was a constellation of commendations and service ribbons, a carefully curated story of a 15-year climb through the department's ranks. But Judge Beaumont noticed the details others missed. The casual, proprietary way his hand rested on the grip of his service weapon during civil proceedings, the cold, calculating sweep of his pale gray eyes as they assessed potential threats not to public safety, but to his own manufactured narrative. When Harrison's gaze met Judge Beaumont's, a flicker of something ugly and familiar crossed his expression. It was something she had seen 1,000 times in her career, a look she recognized from decades of watching men of his ilk assert their dominance in her courtroom. It wasn't quite disrespect. Not yet. It was the subtle, corrosive dismissiveness of a man who viewed a black woman in a position of power as a temporary, inconvenient obstacle, not a legitimate constitutional officer of the court. "Your Honor," Harrison said, the words dripping with a condescending courtesy as he settled into the witness chair with the casual ownership of a king mounting his throne. "I appreciate the court taking time for this matter, but I want to assure you, Jude Coleman's arrest and detention were conducted according to strict departmental protocol and federal guidelines for gang-related activities." Judge Beaumont observed this theatrical performance with the steady, unnerving composure of someone who had spent a lifetime watching petty tyrants transform legal proceedings into personal theater. She had seen Harrison's type before. Men who confused their badges with crowns, men who conveniently forgot that in a democracy, constitutional authority flows from the people, not from the barrel of a government-issued gun. But what Harrison didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have suspected as he began to weave his familiar, well-rehearsed web of lies and half-truths, was that Judge Beaumont had been secretly building a federal case against him for 6 goddamn months. Hidden away in her secure judicial files was a mountain of evidence that would not just destroy his career, but would shatter the entire corrupt network of cops, prosecutors, and city officials who had protected his heinous crimes throughout his bloody rise to power. His next words are going to shock you beyond belief. The silence in courtroom 5B felt different this morning. It was charged with the kind of electric, ozone-heavy tension that precedes a constitutional reckoning. Harrison arranged himself in the witness chair like a king holding court, supremely blissfully unaware that he was about to provide testimony that would send him to a federal supermax prison for the rest of his miserable life. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont began, her voice carrying the measured, unshakable authority of someone who had learned to command respect through sheer competence rather than cheap intimidation. "Please explain to this court the specific evidence that justified holding Jude Coleman without bail for 8 months on charges that appear, on their face, to lack any constitutional foundation whatsoever." What Harrison revealed next would prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Jude Coleman was just his latest victim in a long and sickening pattern of racist violence. A pattern that had been protected by institutional silence for far, far too long. Harrison leaned back slightly in the witness chair, a subtle gesture of disrespect that, in the rigid formality of a federal courtroom, was as loud as a scream. "Your Honor," he began, his voice exuding the practiced, unctuous confidence of a man who had told this same lie dozens of times without ever being seriously challenged. Jude Coleman was arrested during a comprehensive anti-gang operation targeting known criminal networks in the East Denver area. Based on intelligence gathered over several months, we identified patterns of behavior consistent with gang recruitment and initiation activities. Judge Beaumont made careful, deliberate notes, her pen moving with slow precision across a legal pad while her mind deconstructed his familiar, coded language. Anti-gang operation was Harrison's preferred euphemism for what community observers, in sworn affidavits, described as the systematic harassment of black teenagers, whose only crime was existing in neighborhoods where Harrison had unilaterally decided they didn't belong. Detective Harrison, what specific intelligence led to Mr. Coleman's identification as a target of this operation? She asked, her voice calm and even. For the first time, Harrison's smug demeanor flickered. He shot a quick glance toward the prosecutor's table, perhaps expecting a lifeline that wasn't forthcoming, before turning his attention back to the judge. Your Honor, Coleman was observed engaging in suspicious behavior patterns consistent with criminal organization lookout activities. He was frequently present in areas known for drug trafficking and gang recruitment. Judge Beaumont consulted her case files with practiced, almost theatrical precision. According to the arrest report you yourself filed, Detective, Mr. Coleman was waiting for the RTD bus at the intersection of Colfax and Federal at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning on his way to school. Are you now testifying, under oath, that waiting for public transportation to get an education constitutes suspicious gang behavior in your professional opinion? The question dropped into the silent courtroom, like a stone into a still, deep pond, the ripples of its implication spreading outwards. Harrison's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of the witness chair, tightened into white-knuckled fists as he struggled to maintain his flimsy narrative under the weight of basic, logical scrutiny. But this wasn't Harrison's first time targeting innocent black kids, and Judge Beaumont fucking knew it. In the sanctity of her private chambers the previous evening, Judge Beaumont had spread Harrison's case files across her massive mahogany desk like pieces of a deeply disturbing puzzle. The pattern was as undeniable as it was horrifying. 23 arrests of juveniles in the past 2 years. 22 of them involved black teenagers. All were charged with flimsy, catch-all variations of gang-related activity, or conspiracy to commit violent crimes. There was Marcus Washington, 17, arrested for displaying gang colors while wearing his high school's red and black football jersey. There was Destiny Parker, 15, charged with criminal association for walking home with her own cousin, who had been previously arrested by Harrison. And there was Trevor Mitchell, a mere 14 years old, detained for aggressive posturing after having the audacity to ask Harrison why he was being stopped while walking home from the public library. Each case had been systematically plea bargained down to lesser charges or quietly dismissed on technicalities, a strategy that ensured Harrison's vile, unconstitutional methods never faced serious scrutiny in appellate courts. But there was one name that appeared again and again in Harrison's files, a name that made Judge Beaumont's blood run ice cold. Jude's older brother, Marcus Coleman, 17 years old. Shot and killed by Detective Harrison during what the official report cynically described as a justified use of deadly force. What she found in those files would shock you to your core. Detective Harrison, Judge Beaumont continued, consulting her notes with the same deliberate, maddening precision. You mentioned intelligence gathering over several months. Can you provide this court with the documentation of the specific criminal activities Mr. Coleman was allegedly involved in that warranted such prolonged surveillance? Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your Honor, much of our intelligence comes from confidential informants and ongoing surveillance operations. Disclosing that information in open court could compromise those sensitive assets. The classic go-to excuse of a dirty cop with nothing to back up his claims. However, I can assure the court that Coleman's behavior patterns were entirely consistent with known gang recruitment methodologies. The answer revealed more than Harrison intended. It exposed a rotten law enforcement philosophy where suspicion was justification enough for detention, and baseless speculation was a perfectly acceptable substitute for actual, verifiable evidence. It was a philosophy that saw constitutional protections not as the sacred foundation of a just society, but as annoying obstacles to efficient policing. Behind her calm judicial exterior, Judge Beaumont's mind was a whirlwind, racing through the horrifying implications of Harrison's sworn testimony. She had spent the entire previous weekend doing more than just reviewing his arrest records. She had been diving deep into the precinct's broader operational statistics. The numbers painted a picture so stark and disturbing it was impossible to ignore. In Harrison's patrol area, Black teenagers were arrested at a rate 11 times higher than their white counterparts, despite demographic data showing no corresponding difference in actual crime rates. What she found in those files would shock you. The breakthrough in her secret investigation had come 2 weeks earlier. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a formidable veteran from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, had quietly approached Judge Beaumont with grave concerns about Harrison's flagrant and repeated constitutional violations. Torres, a woman with 15 years of experience in federal civil rights enforcement, had been conducting her own covert investigation after receiving a deluge of complaints from community organizations about Harrison's relentless targeting of minority youth. "Judge Beaumont," Torres had said during their confidential, off-the-record meeting in her chambers, "we've been trying to build a solid federal case against Harrison for 18 months, but every time we get close, local evidence conveniently disappears, or witnesses suddenly become reluctant to testify. He's being protected. There's something you need to see." The manila envelope Torres had given her that day contained photocopied documents that should never have left a secure federal evidence locker. They were copies of Harrison's original handwritten incident report from the shooting of Marcus Coleman, notes that had been conspicuously and illegally omitted from the final sanitized version submitted to Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office. The discrepancies were staggering, undeniable, and proof of a criminal conspiracy. In his initial raw report, Harrison had written, "Subject appeared to be surrendering when engagement initiated." But the final, official version stated, "Subject advanced aggressively toward officer position with weapon visible." The original report noted, "No weapon recovered at scene during initial sweep." The official report claimed, "Subject's firearm recovered 12 FT from body, consistent with dropping during fall." But most damning of all, Harrison's preliminary unguarded notes included the phrase, "Unclear why lethal force was necessary given subject's compliance and obvious fear." Judge Beaumont had read those words with a rising tide of horror, understanding that she was looking at concrete evidence of a cover-up so profound that it had to reach far beyond one rogue officer's mistakes. Someone with significant institutional authority had helped Harrison transform a cold-blooded murder into a heroic act of self-defense. And that same corrupt system was now being used to systematically destroy the victim's younger brother through fabricated charges. Harrison had no idea he was about to confess to something much, much worse. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont said, her voice taking on a sharper, more dangerous edge that made several people in the courtroom physically sit up straighter. "In your 15 years in law enforcement, how many juveniles have you arrested for so-called gang-related offenses?" Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, surprised by the change in tack, but not yet alarmed. "I don't keep an exact tally, Your Honor. Probably 80 or 90 cases over the years. Most get resolved with plea agreements. The kids learn a lesson, avoid future criminal involvement. It's a positive outcome." "And of those 80 or 90 cases, what percentage would you estimate involved minority juveniles?" The question dropped into the courtroom like a constitutional bombshell. Harrison's confident mask finally began to crack. He glanced around the room, a cornered animal searching for an escape route that simply didn't exist in a federal court operating under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Your Honor, I don't pay attention to race when I'm making arrests. I respond to criminal behavior patterns, not demographics. That's admirable, Detective, Judge Beaumont said, her voice dripping with irony. But surely you can provide the court with a rough estimate. Half? 3/4? Harrison's hands clenched back into fists. He finally realized the nature of the constitutional trap being meticulously constructed around his own sworn testimony. Your Honor, I patrol areas with diverse demographics. It stands to reason that my arrests would reflect the population of my assigned territory. Judge Beaumont consulted her files with that same deliberate, maddening precision. According to the most recent census data, Detective, your patrol area is 42% Black, 31% Hispanic, and 27% white. Would you be willing to testify, under oath, that your juvenile arrests for the past 5 years reflect that demographic breakdown? The mathematical precision of the question left him no room to deflect or evade. Harrison's face had gone chalk white. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a raw edge of desperation that betrayed his full understanding that his testimony was creating an unassailable constitutional case against him. His next words revealed everything. Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't think racial statistics are relevant to this specific habeas corpus petition, he sputtered. We're here to discuss one individual case involving one specific defendant who engaged in documented criminal behavior. Judge Beaumont leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes never leaving Harrison's increasingly panicked face. Actually, Detective Harrison, a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement is absolutely relevant to constitutional analysis under both the 4th and 14th Amendments. When a law enforcement officer's arrest record shows such extreme racial disparities, it raises fundamental questions about equal protection and selective enforcement. This hearing is about Jude Coleman, but it is also about the Constitution of the United States. Harrison's composure finally shattered completely, revealing the molten core of rage that always lurked just beneath his professional facade. Your Honor, with due respect, he snarled, I've served this community faithfully for 15 years. I have put my life on the line to protect its citizens, including citizens who look like you. The phrase, citizens who look like you, hit the courtroom like a sonic boom. It was a verbal explosion of raw, undisguised racism. Judge Beaumont felt the collective, sharp intake of breath from the gallery, the palpable shock of witnessing someone brazenly cross a line of decency and constitutional propriety that should have been inviolate. But she also felt something else rising inside her. Not anger. It was something colder, purer. It was the crystalline clarity that comes when an adversary reveals their true, monstrous nature so completely that all pretense becomes impossible. Detective Harrison, Judge Beaumont said, rising slowly, deliberately from her chair, her voice a low and dangerous counterpoint to his outburst. Your service record is not being questioned at this moment. Your methods, your judgment, and your apparent belief that a citizen's race determines their constitutional rights. Those are being questioned, and rightfully so, under federal civil rights law. Harrison stood as well, a threatening volcanic eruption of a man. His sheer height and bulk made him tower over the judicial bench in a way that felt calculated and intimidating. But everyone in that courtroom understood that true authority in this sacred space came not from brute physical presence, but from constitutional legitimacy. And Harrison had just forfeited his. He had no idea that Judge Beaumont possessed audio recordings that would not only expose his virulent racism, but would also capture his own voice confessing to the murder of Jude's brother and his diabolical plans to eliminate any potential witnesses. Judge Beaumont had spent 3 long, sleepless nights listening to the damning audio recordings Agent Torres had provided. Each whispered conversation, each casual boast, revealed another sickening layer of institutional corruption that made Harrison's individual crimes, as heinous as they were, seem almost insignificant compared to the monstrous system that had protected and enabled him for so long. The first recording had captured Harrison discussing the shooting of Marcus Coleman with his immediate supervisor, Lieutenant David Cross. The audio quality suggested they were in a noisy bar, the background filled with the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of other conversations. Harrison's voice was slightly slurred with alcohol, but his words were chillingly, unmistakably clear as he discussed the deliberate execution of a 17-year-old boy. "The problem with these little shits, Dave," Harrison's recorded voice had said with a terrifying casualness, "is they actually think the Constitution applies to them the same way it applies to real Americans. That Coleman boy, he just kept talking about his rights, about wanting to call his mother, about being innocent. It made me fucking sick." Lieutenant Cross's response was, if possible, even more damning. "Sometimes, Keith, you have to teach lessons that stick. One dead gangbanger prevents 10 future victims. The community should be pinning a fucking medal on you, not filing complaints." Harrison's raw, cruel laughter echoed through Judge Beaumont's chambers from the recording, a sound of bone-chilling depravity. "Oh, they'll learn. I've already started working on his little brother. The kid thinks he's going to college, thinks his straight A's and his clean record actually matter. I'm going to teach him and his whole goddamn family what happens when you don't show the proper respect." His reaction in the courtroom, when he heard his own voice, was priceless. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont said, calmly consulting another section of her evidence folder, "I'd like to turn our attention to your encounter with Marcus Coleman on September 12th of last year. Do you recall that incident?" Harrison's face went from pale to ghostly white at the mere mention of Marcus Coleman's name. He understood for the first time that the secrets he had so carefully buried were about to be exhumed and dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of constitutional daylight. "Your Honor," he stammered, "that case was thoroughly investigated by Internal Affairs, the DA's office, and an independent civilian review board. I was cleared of any and all wrongdoing. In fact, I received a commendation for heroism in the line of duty." "Yes," Judge Beaumont agreed, her voice dangerously smooth as she pulled a document from her folder and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "The official reports do paint you as quite the hero. According to this final incident report, Marcus Coleman was an armed and dangerous gang member who threatened your life, forcing you to use deadly force in self-defense. Is that an accurate summary?" Harrison nodded eagerly, a drowning man mistaking a shark's fin for a lifeline. "That's absolutely correct, Your Honor. The subject was reaching for a weapon when I discharged my firearm. It was a textbook defensive shooting, completely in line with department policy." Judge Beaumont set the official fraudulent report aside and picked up another document. This one bore Harrison's own spidery handwriting and original electronic timestamps that proved its authenticity beyond any reasonable doubt. "That's interesting, Detective, because your initial incident report, the one you filed just hours after the shooting, tells a very, very different story. A story filled with blatant constitutional violations. The audio they tried so hard to destroy was about to surface." "Your Honor, I don't know what document you're holding," Harrison faltered, "but if it contradicts the official findings—" "This is your original incident report, Detective Harrison, filed electronically at 10:23 p.m. on September 12th, exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes after you shot and killed Marcus Coleman." Judge Beaumont's voice was as precise and unforgiving as a surgeon's scalpel. "Would you like me to read your own initial observations back to the court?" Harrison's hands were trembling violently now, his earlier swagger a distant, pathetic memory. He knew, with sickening certainty, that whatever was in that document would annihilate the carefully constructed fortress of lies that had protected him for over a year. Subject was running away with hands visible when engagement began, Judge Beaumont read aloud, her voice carrying to every corner of the stunned, silent courtroom. No weapon observed at time of first shot. Subject fell immediately and did not move after impact. Unclear why lethal force was initiated. The words landed like constitutional thunderclaps. In the gallery, several people gasped audibly, the full, horrific implication of Harrison's own documentation crashing down upon them. Marcus Coleman hadn't been a threat. He had been running for his life when Harrison shot him in the back, a flagrant and murderous violation of the Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable seizure. Judge Beaumont continued reading from Harrison's own report. Subject was approximately 20 feet away and moving. Harrison lunged forward in his seat, his voice cracking with desperation. Those were preliminary observations. Made under extreme stress. The official investigation determined— The official investigation, Judge Beaumont said, her voice dropping to a quiet, devastating finality, was a criminal cover-up, and you are about to discover exactly how deep and extensive that conspiracy was. She gestured to her court administrator, who, with practiced and quiet efficiency, had been setting up audiovisual equipment. What the court is about to hear, Judge Beaumont announced to the breathless room, is a recording of Detective Harrison discussing his deliberate murder of Marcus Coleman and his subsequent plans to frame Marcus's younger brother as a sick act of revenge against a family for having the audacity to seek justice. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, filled with the unmistakable voices of Harrison and Lieutenant Cross, captured by a federal wiretap in the dim, conspiratorial atmosphere of Murphy's Tavern on East Colfax. Harrison's recorded voice, thick with booze and malice, filled the constitutional silence. You should have seen the look on that little fucker's face, that Coleman kid, when he finally realized I wasn't going to let him just run home to mommy. 17 years old and still believed the fucking Constitution was going to protect him from reality. Lieutenant Cross's harsh, gravelly laugh provided a sickening counterpoint. These families need to understand that filing complaints has consequences. You can't have the relatives of gangbangers thinking they can challenge police authority without paying a steep price. Harrison's voice swelled with a chilling, sociopathic pride. That's exactly why I'm working on the little brother now, Jude. He thinks he's going to college, thinks his good grades and his clean record matter. Bullshit. I'm teaching him and his whole disrespectful family what happens when you don't show proper respect for the law. The present-day Harrison, sitting in the witness chair, had gone completely ashen, beads of sweat popping out on his forehead and tracing paths down his temples, despite the courtroom's cool, controlled temperature. His mouth moved soundlessly, a fish gasping for air as he listened to his own voice confessing to constitutional crimes that carried federal penalties up to and including life without the possibility of parole. But wait, there's more evidence you haven't seen yet. The recording continued, with Lieutenant Cross providing specific, detailed instructions on evidence manipulation and orchestrating a cover-up. The key, Keith, is making sure the paperwork tells the right story right from the fucking beginning. As long as all the reports show imminent threat and justified response, Internal Affairs will back our play every single time. They have to. Harrison's recorded response laid bare the systematic, premeditated nature of their constitutional violations. I've been using that exact playbook for 5 years now. The beauty of it is, once a kid has Judge Beaumont watched Harrison's face cycle through a kaleidoscope of panic, desperation, and finally, a cold, reptilian calculation as he realized that his most private criminal confessions had been preserved for federal prosecution. The confident, swaggering officer who had stormed into her courtroom just an hour ago was being methodically dissected and replaced by a desperate, cornered criminal watching his entire world of lies and impunity collapse in real time. Where "Where did you get that recording?" Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's low ventilation hum. "From someone who couldn't live with the conspiracy of silence anymore," Judge Beaumont replied, with cold, constitutional precision. "Someone who understood that protecting murderers makes you an accessory to a federal crime." But the recording wasn't finished. Cross's voice droned on, outlining the administrative details of destroying evidence. "Make sure the body camera footage gets corrupted during processing. Say it was a technical difficulty. Happens all the time, especially with the older equipment. No one can prove otherwise." Harrison's laugh, when it came, echoed through the speakers with a stomach-turning casual cruelty. "Already handled it. The footage shows exactly what we needed it to show. Subject reaching toward his waistband, aggressive posturing, failure to comply with lawful commands. It's the same fucking template that's worked for us dozens of times before." His reaction when he realized the true scope was priceless. Harrison finally grasped that his secret thoughts, his ugliest beliefs, his most criminal actions had been meticulously documented and preserved. His swagger had evaporated, replaced by the hollow, vacant look of a man watching his entire career, a career built on the systematic violation of human rights, implode before his very eyes. "Your Honor," Harrison said desperately, trying to grasp at straws. "Those conversations were taken out of context. Cops sometimes use dark humor to cope with the immense stress of the job." "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont interrupted, her voice cutting through his pathetic lies. "We just heard you and your direct supervisor celebrating the cold-blooded murder of a 17-year-old boy and meticulously planning to frame his younger brother as retaliation against a family seeking constitutional justice. There is no goddamn context in the universe that makes these federal civil rights violations acceptable." The suffocating weight of Harrison's exposed crimes hung over the courtroom like toxic smoke. But Judge Beaumont wasn't finished with him. Not yet. She had one more devastating piece of documentation that would prove Harrison's crimes extended far beyond individual acts of racist violence to include racketeering, widespread conspiracy, and the systematic deprivation of civil rights under color of law, an institutional cancer that had been allowed to metastasize for years. But the judge wasn't done with him yet. As Harrison slumped in the witness chair, a broken and defeated man, Judge Beaumont prepared to reveal evidence that would demonstrate his individual crimes were merely the tip of a monstrous iceberg. They were part of a larger, more organized criminal enterprise that had been systematically violating the constitutional rights of minority youth for over a decade, all with official protection and unwavering institutional support. What Harrison was about to discover, to his absolute horror, was that Judge Beaumont had been secretly collaborating with federal investigators for months, and everything he had just said under oath, every lie, every denial, every pathetic excuse, was being transmitted in real time to a team of FBI agents who were, at that very moment, executing arrest warrants for his entire corrupt network of co-conspirators. Judge Beaumont opened another, thicker section of her evidence folder, revealing documents that bore official FBI letterhead and sealed federal grand jury indictments. Harrison's eyes widened in dawning terror as he recognized the federal law enforcement insignia, understanding for the first time that his sordid local crimes had attracted the lethal attention of powers far beyond the Denver courthouse. "Detective Harrison?" Judge Beaumont said, her voice now resonating with the full weight of federal authority. "What you don't seem to understand is that this habeas corpus hearing stopped being about Jude Coleman the moment you confessed to the premeditated murder of Marcus Coleman under color of law. Federal authorities have been monitoring this entire proceeding based on evidence that was brought to their attention months ago." As if summoned by her words, the courtroom's large rear doors swung open to admit 4 grim-faced individuals in dark, severe suits. Their movements were precise, purposeful, and utterly menacing. The lead figure, a stern-faced woman with graying hair and eyes like chips of granite, approached the bench, her federal credentials already in hand. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. We have federal warrants for Detective Keith Harrison's arrest on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit murder, and a pattern of systematic violation of civil rights." Harrison whipped his head around, his eyes wild and panicked, as he finally understood that his constitutional violations had been witnessed not just by local court personnel, but by federal law enforcement officials who had been meticulously building a massive RICO case against him for months. "This is impossible," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Internal Affairs cleared me. The DA's office reviewed every case. I followed department protocol to the fucking letter." Agent Torres approached Harrison, dangling a pair of handcuffs, her expression a mask of professional neutrality, but her intent unmistakable. "Detective Keith Harrison, you are under federal arrest for violations of Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. You have the right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution you so clearly despise." You won't believe what they captured on tape. As Agent Torres began to read Harrison his Miranda rights, Judge Beaumont knew there was one final devastating piece of evidence that had to be entered into the record before he was taken into federal custody. The audio recording they'd just heard was more than enough to secure multiple life sentences. But there was another conversation, a much more recent one, that would expose the full, breathtaking scope of the criminal enterprise he was a part of. "Agent Torres," Judge Beaumont said, holding up a hand to pause the arrest. "Before you process Detective Harrison, there's additional evidence your RICO investigation needs to hear. Evidence that reveals this conspiracy extends to the absolute highest levels of Colorado law enforcement." Harrison's face, already pale, turned a sickly, greenish gray as Judge Beaumont gestured for her court administrator to load another audio file. "What the court is about to hear," she announced, her voice echoing with righteous power, "is a recording of Detective Harrison discussing his methods with none other than Police Chief William Patterson, the commanding officer of the entire Denver Police Department. This conversation took place 4 months ago at the annual Police Benevolent Association conference. If you believe that young people like Jude Coleman deserve constitutional protection from corrupt officers like this, type justice below." The speakers filled with the cacophony of a crowded conference room, a backdrop of administrative noise. Harrison's voice emerged from the din, slightly drunk, but clearly discussing his criminal approach to law enforcement with his own chief of police. "Chief Patterson," Harrison's recorded voice said, filled with smug self-importance, "I just wanted to thank you personally for backing me up on that Coleman shooting. Some of the community leaders have been making noise, asking questions about my methods, but it's damned reassuring to know that command supports proactive policing." Patterson's gravelly, whiskey-soaked voice responded with the casual authority of a mob boss, revealing the deep institutional nature of the conspiracy. "Keith, you just keep doing what needs to be done to maintain order in those communities. The public doesn't understand the realities of urban law enforcement. Sometimes all these constitutional niceties have to take a backseat to public safety. It's the only way." Harrison's current reaction in the courtroom was a study in complete psychological collapse. He finally understood that his private, conspiratorial conversations with the city's highest-ranking law enforcement official were now part of a federal criminal investigation that could result in RICO prosecutions reaching all the way to the goddamn mayor's office. "Wait until you see what happened to the other officers." The recording continued, with Patterson providing specific criminal guidance on how to avoid federal civil rights prosecutions. "The key is the documentation, Keith. It has to support your threat assessment and the imminent danger findings. As long as your reports use the right constitutional buzzwords, federal prosecutors will have a bitch of a time proving discriminatory intent. Harrison's recorded voice was thick with gratitude for the criminal tutelage. That's exactly what Lieutenant Cross taught me. We've actually developed standardized language that works for almost any situation. Aggressive posturing, failure to comply with lawful commands, reasonable fear for officer safety. It's fucking impossible for those civil rights attorneys to prove what a cop's real intent was. This wasn't just corruption. It was a carefully engineered, systematic approach to circumventing the Constitution itself. But what Harrison was about to hear next would prove that his individual crimes were part of a vast statewide network of police corruption that included coordinated evidence tampering, rampant witness intimidation, and the systematic elimination of constitutional rights for any minority youth who dared to question their authority. The scope of the federal investigation expanded in real time as the recordings continued, revealing insidious connections between Harrison's individual crimes and a sprawling, statewide network of officers. They shared intelligence on problem families, coordinated their responses to civil rights complaints, and provided mutual, ironclad protection from any form of constitutional accountability. Agent Torres had stopped reading Harrison his rights, understanding that the evidence being revealed was fundamentally changing the scope of her investigation from a few bad apples to a rotten fucking orchard. A massive RICO conspiracy involving dozens of law enforcement officials across multiple jurisdictions. The recording played on, with Chief Patterson revealing the structure of their institutional support system. We've been working with the chiefs in Boulder, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction. We share information on problem families and those pain-in-the-ass activist attorneys. When someone files a federal civil rights complaint against one of our guys, we make sure their name gets circulated to every department statewide. A little extra scrutiny usually cools their jets. Harrison's recorded response exposed the sickening, systematic nature of their retaliation. That's brilliant, Chief. We've been using that exact network to track the Coleman family's movements since they hired that fucking civil rights lawyer. Every traffic stop, every minor interaction with any family member gets documented, shared, and added to the file. Judge Beaumont felt a cold, righteous satisfaction as she watched the constitutional foundations of Harrison's criminal enterprise crumble into dust in real time. Agent Torres's radio crackled with clipped professional updates from other federal teams executing simultaneous operations across the state. Command, we have Chief Patterson in custody at his residence. Lieutenant Cross is barricaded in his office at headquarters, but he is contained. We've seized approximately 600 case files and 23 computer servers from 4 different police stations. Harrison, now on his feet and being hauled away by 2 massive federal marshals, finally snapped. This is all because of one punk gangbanger, he bellowed, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. Everything was fine. Everything was constitutional until you people started stirring up all this civil rights trouble. But the recording wasn't finished. There was one last piece that would expose the full depth of their depravity. It was Patterson discussing what they'd do after the current period of federal oversight ended. The feds pull out in 18 months. After that, we'll have even more flexibility to handle these problem families and activist communities without Washington breathing down our necks. And Harrison's reply sealed the fate of everyone involved. I've already started working on a list, Chief. A list of families and individuals who are going to need a serious attitude adjustment once the federal heat is off. The Coleman family is at the top of that list. The court was listening to evidence of a criminal conspiracy so vast it was almost unbelievable. It included planned intimidation, systematic evidence destruction, and a long-term strategy for retaliation against any citizen who sought constitutional protection from police misconduct. But what Judge Beaumont was about to reveal next was the final, most horrific piece of the puzzle. It would prove that Harrison's network hadn't just been violating rights. They had been systematically murdering black teenagers across 3 states, with each killing meticulously covered up by the same evidence-tampering protocols they had just heard described in cold, brutal detail. The moment that would be studied in constitutional law classes for generations was now building with the terrible, inexorable momentum of historical inevitability. Harrison's hand moved toward the judicial gavel with the calculated precision of a man who had committed acts of violence so often that it had become his instinctive response to any challenge to his authority. Judge Beaumont observed his movement with the steady, unbreakable composure of someone who had spent her entire career refusing to be intimidated by violent men who confused physical dominance with legitimate power. Federal agents throughout the courtroom tensed, but their orders were clear. Document the assault. Let it happen unless her life was in immediate danger. The constitutional implications were too important. They needed the world to see his complete rejection of the law. Harrison's fingers closed around the polished wood of the gavel. "Judge Beaumont," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom. "It's time someone taught you the difference between legal theory and real-world consequences." "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont replied, her voice maintaining perfect judicial composure. "The only lesson being taught here today is that the Constitution will always prevail over authoritarian violence, regardless of the personal cost to those who uphold it." "You constitutional-loving bitch!" Harrison screamed, his voice a raw, primal roar of a man whose world of protected criminality was finally facing accountability. "You think hiding behind your robes protects you from people who understand real power." The gavel flew from Harrison's hand with the force of a trained fighter, spinning through the air directly toward Judge Beaumont's head. Federal cameras captured every single frame, documenting his complete and utter rejection of judicial authority. Crack! The gavel struck Judge Beaumont square in the center of her forehead with a sickening, devastating impact. The sound echoed through the marble courtroom like a constitutional thunderclap. She staggered backward from the force of the blow, but she did not fall. Blood streamed down her face, staining the front of her black judicial robes, but she remained standing. Her eyes never closed. Her dignity never wavered. Her authority never diminished. She remained upright behind the judicial bench, refusing to give this violent thug the satisfaction of seeing the rule of law brought to its knees. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos as federal agents swarmed Harrison with practiced, overwhelming force, while others moved to protect the judge. Harrison stood over the bench for a fleeting second, a conqueror surveying his territory, his face twisted with savage satisfaction. "That's what happens when you forget your fucking place," he snarled, but his moment of triumph was pathetic and brief. Agent Torres's voice cut through the noise with the sharp crack of federal authority. "Keith Harrison, you are under arrest for assault on a federal judicial officer, a felony punishable by up to 30 years in federal prison. So, moi." The man who had entered the courtroom with arrogant impunity was now face down on the cold marble floor, his hands cuffed violently behind his back, his world collapsing around him. Judge Beaumont slowly pulled herself upright, her face a mask of blood, but her voice the embodiment of unbreakable resolve. "Let the federal record show," she stated clearly, "that Detective Keith Harrison has physically assaulted a sitting federal judge during constitutional proceedings before multiple federal witnesses, thereby demonstrating his complete and total rejection of the rule of law." But his violent, desperate act was only the beginning of the reckoning. It was the signal. While Judge Beaumont's courage would inspire a generation, federal agents were, at that very moment, executing simultaneous arrests across 3 states, bringing down the largest and most corrupt police network in modern American history. 2 years after the sound of the gavel echoed through the halls of justice, Zaria Coleman knocked softly on the door to Judge Beaumont's chambers. She carried a small, wrapped package. Jude had not only been released, but had graduated as valedictorian and was now at Howard University on a full scholarship, studying to become a constitutional law attorney. The photo she brought was of her 2 sons, smiling, with an engraved plaque that read, "Constitutional justice delayed is not justice denied when good people decide to speak truth to federal power." The Harrison case became a watershed moment. The federal consent decree that followed became a model for police reform nationwide. Crime rates in the over-policed neighborhoods actually dropped as community trust was slowly, painfully rebuilt. Jude, in his graduation speech, said, "Judge Beaumont showed me that one person, armed with the law and a refusal to be intimidated, can change everything." Judge Beaumont kept the photo on her desk, a daily reminder. The scar on her forehead had faded, but remained visible, a permanent mark of the moment she chose constitutional dignity over personal safety. Harrison was serving multiple life sentences in a federal supermax prison, a cautionary tale taught to every new FBI agent. His name was a synonym for corruption. Her name became a synonym for courage. The system he had perverted had, in the end, been purified by the fire he himself had started, because he made the fatal mistake of attacking a woman who was not just a judge, but the living, breathing embodiment of the Constitution he so violently despised. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for these constitutional principles means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and federal justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of constitutional truth.